So today we're doing what we call one of our up-to-the-minute events. We try to do these when things are unraveling around the world and we want to shed some light onto what's going on in real time in the news. And we're very lucky because we really only have to look down our hallway to find the appropriate speakers for these types of events. So today we're going to hear a little bit about Egypt, probably mostly about Syria. And to do this, we're going to hear first from Dan Kurtzer, who is one of our professors here at the Woodrow Wilson School and the former U.S. ambassador to Egypt and to Israel. We're also going to hear from Max Weiss, who's an assistant professor of history and Near Eastern studies. So this is a wonderful opportunity for us to reach outside the Woodrow Wilson School and across the street to Near Eastern studies. And Wolfgang Danspeckgruber, who runs the Liechtenstein Institute on Self-Determination here at this school, and who's been very involved in the whole Syrian conflict in recent months. So thank you very much, and we will begin.
All right, I'm going to lead off with a few comments on Egypt and Syria. As we've talked about in the past, the Middle East is a target-rich environment, and so we could actually focus on a lot of things, including the possibility of peacemaking in the Israeli-Palestinian context, but I'm sure Elizabeth will get us back here for another chance to discuss that. In Egypt, the concerns today, as you are reading in the paper, relate to the possible return to authoritarianism and to a police state which has been absent, at least in our hopes of the last 2 years. And there are a number of quite worrying signs in this regard. First of all, the emergency law, which had been in effect in Egypt from 1981 until the revolution in 2011, was just reinstated a short while ago by this interim government that came into being after the elected president, Mohamed Morsi, was disposed. And it's now been extended. And there's concern that what looked like a temporary institution of an emergency capability to deal with infractions of law and order may be creeping into some long-term prospect. Second, the security sector in Egypt, which has always been very large and largely untamed, constituting almost 2 million police officers, paramilitary, intelligence, and related, is feeling its oats. You recall after the 2011 election, revolution, the police largely went home and felt that the society had rejected them. There was a period of the absence of law and order. The police are now back in a big way, particularly as the new government with its military backers has made the restoration of law and order and security its primary objectives in the short term. And this has given rise to concerns about human rights abuses that the police have for many years been accused of in Egypt. In that respect, allegations of human rights abuses have so far gone unanswered and not looked into. And it may be that the police are getting a free ride during this period of concern about security. A fourth signpost, recently the new government appointed governors for Egypt's governorates. And in a move reminiscent of the Mubarak era, 18 of the 25 governors came from the military, took off their uniform, and are now wearing civilian clothes. And the other 7 are former officials or people associated with Mubarak's party, the National Democratic Party. In other words, the concerns that we had talked about here over the past few years about the reemergence of the old Egyptian state may be actually coming into play. Notwithstanding the concerns that many outsiders have with respect to these activities, the majority in Egypt appears to support these moves, in large part out of antipathy towards the actions of the Muslim Brotherhood over the previous approximately year that President Morsi was in power, and I think in larger part as a result of the breakdown in law and order and the absence of public security. Many of you know that Egypt was one of the safest places in the world to be up until the time of the revolution. And since the revolution, it's generally considered to be a relatively unsafe place because of the absence of law and order mechanisms. And so even though the majority would respond to public opinion polling by saying that they want to see the gains of the revolution preserved, they also seem to support this, at least what they hope is a short-term turn towards law and order, hoping that it doesn't bring the attendant consequences of a return to authoritarianism. While this is happening, the interim government has appointed a committee to look into revising the Constitution. As we talked about over the past couple of years, one of the most interesting aspects of the Egyptian Revolution was the fact that it had turned so immediately to constitutionalism as a prevailing way of trying to organize Egyptian society and defining Egypt's post-Mubarak identity. There was a revolution adopted a little less than a year ago, but there was a constitution adopted a little less than a year ago, but it was largely discredited when the liberal parties and the opposition walked out of that constitutional assembly and boycotted. There is now an effort to see whether or not some of the supposed excesses in that constitution can't be amended, and a constitution that better reflects the tone and tenor of this revolution can be adopted. But this constitutional amendment process itself is leading to some controversy, as the Islamist parties, apart from the Muslim Brotherhood, which obviously is going to oppose the constitutional amendments, the Salafists, however we call them, more fundamentalist Islamists, are concerned that some of the gains that they think they made in the constitutional amendment process are now going to be lost in the backlash against the Muslim Brotherhood-led effort. And it's quite possible that this constitutional battle is yet to play itself out as the various committees bring forth their work. The Egyptian economy remains in crisis, although the immediacy of the crisis that we had talked about over the course of the past 2 years seems to have receded somewhat, largely as a result of a large influx of financial assistance from Saudi Arabia and the Gulf. So there's a temporary palliative here, and it's represented something of a safety net. But the main indicators of economic stability and change still remain in crisis mode. Egyptian industry has not yet returned to its strength as before the revolution, and many of the industries that had largely supported this rentier economy, tourism and expatriate labor, are not anywhere near where they were before the revolution. So the economy still remains a problem, and as it does remain a problem, any efforts at reform are likely to be stymied by the military, which maintains pretty much of an iron grip on certain sectors of the economy in order to promote its own narrow interests. Finally, in regard to the internal scene, there's a large question as to whether or not General Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, the defense minister and commander of the armed forces, will in fact remain in the barracks and keep the military in the barracks, or whether or not he has presidential ambitions. There may be a some popular support for his becoming president. If you look at pro-government rallies, you'll see his picture quite predominant. But there's also concern that should he decide to run for president in an election that he is likely to win, this would simply be Mubarakism with a new face. What does it mean for U.S. policy? One of the great paradoxes of the past 2 years of strife between the United States and Egypt is that the basic interests that underpin our two countries have largely remained unchanged. Both of us still are interested in maintaining the validity of the Egyptian-Israeli peace treaty, as it does still represent something of a basis for peacemaking activities in the region. We still both benefit from our military relationship. The Egyptian military may be less dependent on the United States on the daily feed of our assistance to maintain itself, but in terms of its overall doctrine, training, and equipment, it has largely become an extension of an American-Egyptian strategic plan, and that has not changed at all. Egypt's security threats remain not only the way they were in the past, but in some cases now have intensified. More concern about developments to its south in the Nile Basin and the possibility of Ethiopian activities to dam up one of the sources of the Nile River, creating ultimately a water crisis in Egypt. Concerns about excuse me, spillover from the Libyan instability. No real concerns about Israel other than large political concerns. But now one of the most predominant features in the Egyptian landscape is a destabilization threat from internally from the Sinai Peninsula, and the possibility of what I guess we would call jihadist or even al-Qaeda elements filling in a vacuum that's been created by this absence of law and order. So in this period, which has been marked by significant discord between the United States and Egypt, nonetheless, our strategic interests have largely remained the same as they've been over time. And what this suggests is that we are facing much more of a problem over language and rhetoric, and over, in our case, America's propensity to try to decide Egypt's internal future, than we are over raison d'etat, over strategic interests that may divide us. Egyptians have always been exceedingly nervous about interference in their domestic affairs by anybody, and that has been now sharpened as a result of the revolution. And to the extent that the administration wants not only to maintain a strategic relationship with Egypt, but also to see Egypt move in a certain direction, a liberal, open democracy, we seem to be getting in the way of this Egyptian attitude. And so how the United States balances this ongoing strategic interest with the interest that we are trying to find relative safe ground with respect to Egyptian internal change will be one of the great policy dilemmas that we're going to face in the immediate future. I've run over my time. I did have a few things to say on Syria, but I'll save them because you've got two Syrian experts about to speak. Thank you very much.
Go ahead, Mike.
All right, well, I'd like to thank the Wilson School for this rather sudden invitation. I am a fish out of water on the other side of Washington Road, so I hope you'll forgive if I am flopping around a little bit. I'm also not disposed to speak too much about the questions that Ambassador Kurtzer ended off on, although I'm happy to try to talk about them in the Q&A with respect to issues of geopolitics, strategic interests of the U.S. and other Middle Eastern actors. What I wanted to do was to talk a bit about how the current and ongoing Syria crisis could be understood otherwise. So I'm just going to make a few points in order to broaden the discussion, I hope. As most of you are probably aware, today is the day in which the United Nations has received its the report from inspectors into the issue of the use of chemical weapons during the Syrian conflict very recently. And I'm sure Wolfgang is going to have something to say about some of the international diplomatic repercussions of this report of the chemical weapons issue. I want to start out by emphasizing that although the U.S. political and media environment has gone into somersaults over the chemical weapons issue, and although the question of intervention, which I'll turn to in a moment, has become the order of the day, the issue of chemical weapons is not at the heart of the Syria crisis. What is at stake in Syria is much larger than that. So we can debate the issue of getting all Middle Eastern states who are not yet signatories to the chemical weapons treaties on board with it. And that is a question that is obviously of the utmost importance at the moment on a global scale. But I want to emphasize that there are other ongoing crises in Syria that have been going on for 2.5 years now that are just as worthy of our attention. So in addition to saying that chemical weapons, while on the front page of the newspapers and in the forefront of our minds here, is only one issue among several. The issue of humanitarian intervention is something that certainly is going to come up in the discussion here as well, and I simply want to stress again that although there had been some involved in the Syria crisis for the past 2.5 years who had been demanding intervention on the part of the US and other international actors, the chemical weapons issue is but one more chapter in that story. So with those two caveats framing what I have to say, I would like to emphasize that the crisis in Syria is critically not one that can be understood as a bipolar conflict between the Syrian regime and the armed opposition. And so the forgotten, if you like, the unsung heroes in the heart and soul of what is still called by many people the Syrian Revolution are, in the main, non-violent revolutionaries who organized themselves beginning from March 2011 into an amazing array and institutional body of local coordinating committees. And those voices who remain at the core of the Syrian struggle for the very principles that Ambassador Kurtzer was suggesting are at the heart of US strategic interests in the region, including liberalization, democratization, the spread of rights, and so on, remain central to the hearts and minds of those very actors who, again, I think are being drowned out in a broader discussion of the extent to which the opposition has already been Islamized, the extent to which the opposition is already hijacked by radical, call them fundamentalist or jihadi or al-Qaeda elements. And so I simply want to stress that regardless of how the humanitarian intervention discussion plays out, and regardless of how the chemical weapons issue is ultimately debated and decided, what matters in the long term is, as almost every world leader has said up until now, finding a political or a diplomatic solution to the Syria crisis. So the question before us, and indeed before those who have a connection to the decisions that are being made on a global and on a regional level, include how best to get there. I have argued, and I would continue to argue, that the best way, and I imagine that Wolfgang will touch on this issue as well, to continue to push for a diplomatic solution in Syria is to get all of the local, regional, and international actors to the, or all of the, tables. Now is a particularly propitious moment, it seems to me, to push for even greater diplomatic activity now that there is a lull in terms of the beating of the drums of war. So whereas in the case of Egypt we have a fairly well-established political foundation for the negotiation of everyday political life, whereas we have a process by which the formal representatives, at least up until the coup of this past summer, had at least some ability to participate in the political game in Egypt, we confront a very different situation in Syria, wherein there will be the need for a much stronger, indeed robust, commitment to building the kind of political and democratic institutions that can incorporate all of these elements. And so, again, resolving the issue of responsibility for the use of chemical weapons, most recently, regarding the issue of resolving to bring certain figures, including Bashar al-Assad and his allies, and perhaps other elements within the rebel forces, to justice before international legal institutions, such as the International Criminal Court. These are all discussions that remain open and important for discussion. But the most urgent matter remains, at least on the ground, inside Syria, a resolution, first of all, a ceasefire and a commitment to some kind of political process. And I would stress again that it's my personal opinion that the only way this is going to be even moderately successful is to incorporate actors and voices from across the political spectrum and across the regional landscape. That entails Western powers, regional powers, and local actors. So I would stress there, with respect to Syria proper, this means not only the official representative of the Syrian opposition, namely the National Council, but also those actors, some of whom have integrated themselves into the council proper, some of whom remain independent. And so this is a process of diplomatic activity that is well beyond my pay grade. So in terms of being able to make such a thing happen, I would certainly cede the floor to more seasoned folks in order to hear about what that would practically mean. But again, from my perspective, finding a way to incorporate all of the Syrian players on the ground in Syria and outside into such a process remains essential, and indeed there may not be a better moment than right now to begin to act on it.
Thanks very much. Well, delighted that this is organized and that we are able to discuss with you. What I'm saying is, I would like to say, is really, I say it in my personal capacity as Wolfgang Danspeckgruber. Number one, what is the Syrian conflict? There is no such thing yet as a unit about explaining what this conflict represents. Some argue it's a civil war. We had countless meetings here where we said, and it was told us, no, it's not. Others say it's a sectarian war. No, it's not. Others say it is really a strife. It was at least a strife for, as you rightly mentioned, for simply opening up, as one of the Syrians told me, for just human dignity and a credible future. For us here, if I could have my first slide, I thought I'd go with you quickly through some of the key issues, and then we have Q&A. And, oh, supposedly it would shine up as there, but it doesn't. Okay. Let me first say you have to talk, at least, if you analyze the Syrian conflict, you have at least to talk about, I do it like in class and get up. You have to talk about at least 4 stages. Leave this for a second away. The first is we had the beginning of a revolution and the beginning of an opposition struggle in March of 2011. And we had then an ongoing development, and it became stronger and stronger, and in part the government, the regime reacted with some kind of trying to negotiate, but very quickly with utmost brutality. And I remember when you had one of your visitors here, and she described where she was. Can I have the Syrian map? Go down. Yeah, here. So it sort of began here and then moved to Damascus. And so this is phase 1 when you had a struggle. And the international community just saw it as part of the struggle. And remember, that was a struggle where we were focusing on Libya and where we also had, much forgotten, Bahrain. Major issues at that time. And then this is phase 1, which then eventually moved into phase 2, where I would say by fall of 2011, you had the beginning of an increasingly effective somehow a way of interaction, the various areas of revolution sort of spurred, not revolution, I don't want to call it a revolution, but really armed struggle. You had a lot of demonstrations or whatever, and it sprayed around, but it hadn't yet touched Aleppo, and it hadn't yet touched Damascus. And eventually, by spring of 2012, you began with phase 3, where that was a time where we had, some of you were with us at that time, where we had the big Duisenberg meeting, and it became clear that on the one hand, the Syrian opposition which was by that already quite convoluted, tried to organize itself, tried to get into one leadership, and the discussion was in order to stop and to save at least civilians. There was lots of discussion, amongst others by Anne-Marie Slaughter, about the safe zones and no-fly zones. And that meant that on the one hand you had quite some brutality with, from the regime as it tried to clamp down, but you had also a beginning quite effective influx of material resources and tactical things from, and certainly money, from especially the Gulf state, especially Qatar at that time, some Kuwaitis, and Saudi Arabia. And you had a disunity amongst regional actors. Let's not forget, Syria is surrounded by key regional actors in this conflict. Turkey on the one hand, certainly Lebanon and Jordan, and Iraq, and then of course you have, as a key actor in the conflict, Qatar and Saudi Arabia, and yes, two other key powers, Iran and Russia. For the United States of America, my dear friends, we have to keep this in mind. Syria has been terra nulla for decades. Why? Syria was the staunch ally of the Soviet Union, and as much of the Syrian internal construction and infrastructure was done by East Germany. And much of the training of Syrian officials was done by either Russia or by the East Germans. Yes, Iran is relevant, but no, for the actual acting of Syrian officials and Syrian military, it is East Germany and it is Russia in particular. And then many Syrian ladies found that it's much better to marry, many Russian ladies found it's much better to marry a Syrian man who doesn't drink and might have a decent job. So you have 50,000 at least, if not 100,000, the numbers are wild, of Russian women living in Syria, being married to Syrian nomenclatura. And then, of course, much of the Syrian infrastructure, electric power, was built by Siemens and other German and East German companies. So you have this special, so Syria for the Eastern Europeans, East Germany was a long time part of Eastern Europe, and for Russia, Syria has a totally different meaning. And I haven't even mentioned yet the relationship with Iran. This has been much written about, and we can come back to this. But in the spring, in the spring and summer of 2012, the crisis, which then developed for many of us to a civil war-like situation, became very intense, so intense that some intelligence services said it's only a question of time till Assad is falling. By summer of 2012, and especially fall of 2012, the countdown of the demise of the Assad regime ran fast, and there were wildest projections of Assad being out in March. Remember that. No more money, no more thing, whatever. So I remember when we had one of our meetings in Vienna in November last year, that the saying basically was, don't worry, try to help the refugees abroad, but the Assad regime is going to fall. The issue then was, however, that the question raised, there were two questions which we raised in our meetings, and I'm proud to say that the first one was in April 2012, the chemical weapons. Go to the chemical weapons file. Syria has more wild numbers than 20,000 tons of chemical weapons. Syria has had the chemical weapons as its, as it called, deterrent of the small man, the cheap deterrent, against Israeli nuclear weapons. That was the Syrian dictum. And Syria could never have built its chemical weapons arsenal, nor its chemical weapons way how to deal with, without active Soviet support. It became very clear that the chemical weapons might be, anybody of you has ever heard about Sun Tzu, the Chinese strategist, the last attempt where it says in Sun Tzu, don't ever corner your enemy. And I've heard from people who negotiated with President Assad that he would sometimes just mention, before we go down, we burn the earth and the region. You hear parts of Soviet strategy in it, but you obviously hear other elements in it also. That was by 2012. And lo and behold, by March 2000, it sort of developed, that was actually in May 2012, I can't say precisely, but he said this. By fall 2012 then, there was this sort of feeling that he would, it would sort of go down. And in one of our meetings in Vienna in November, we warned that if there is the perception in the Assad regime that it could come to the final moment, beware of the chemical systems. Lo and behold, end of November 2012, there were first clear identifications by intelligence operations that they begin the stage one of mixing and preparing chemical warheads. I'm not an expert in chemical bacteriological warfare, but I can only tell you using chemical weapons is very complex indeed. You have to prepare it, you have to mix it, you have to then prepare them for the filling process into the warhead, which is a highly dangerous process. And then you have roughly 6 weeks to use the warhead. Otherwise, there's a chemical process inside which makes it in. To destroy chemical weapons is one of the world's most complicated ways. And certainly you cannot bomb them. And you can't bomb the various elements. So there was a moment when there was phase 1 or phase 2 of the preparation of chemical weapons in the way in November 2012. It was just after our meeting. I will never forget the emails we got. This was created a concerted reaction, and I want to emphasize this, by Sergei Lavrov and Hillary Clinton, and I think even President Obama, to tell the Syrians, don't, yet, you do not. So stop. December 2012, it was clear, it was stopped. And then came something else. Phase 4 began spring this year. And this something else was, remember we had the Munich Security Conference where with Lakhdar Brahimi and others, one met all kinds of leaders, including of the opposition, who were there in Munich. And there was an effort to talk, and to talk even with having the Iranians in the vicinity. Because it was very clear, and I want to say I propagate and I really applaud what Max said before, I do only believe in a diplomatic solution. You cannot solve Syria militarily. You have to do it diplomatically, but with force. But you have to do it diplomatically. And the issue was that by that time there was the perception we could move. But suddenly, within the opposition, Al-Khatib he suggested to talk to Assad. I was at that time in Cairo, we met in Cairo. There was a real involvement. Many of you might have met the Archbishop of Aleppo, who was here, was deeply involved in this process. to talk, to reach out. And then suddenly the Syrian opposition changed the leadership. There was a major leadership crisis, and I can't tell you how precisely, but by March, April, we heard first reports of effective Hezbollah involvement in the fighting. And a whole new way, I remember having an argument with an Iranian colleague about the 1 billion line of credit which they got, having a whole new phase of additional materials coming in. And that began to change the tide. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to emphasize that by that time we had roughly 85 to 90,000 dead, and we had already at that time more than 2 million refugees abroad and more than 4 million internally displaced. And if we quickly go to the second slide and then I stop, no, go up, back. Well, yeah, that's fine. Where we are now is you have certain areas where you have, you can see this yourself, a clear sort of line of stalemate, but you have to come back to this. I would like to make you aware that in terms of foreign involvement, as I said, you have special great power involvement there. You have great power interest, particularly by the Russians, also by the French to a certain degree. Now, suddenly by the United States, which we didn't have for a long time. We have huge macro-regional effects. By macro, I mean like Saudi Arabia and other powers involved there. And you have something else. You have a president of the United States who got himself caught with the term red line. But the red line was, first of all, coincidentally raised. And secondly, I teach diplomacy, and in diplomacy you have the meaning of words. The reason why the red line has such a specific meaning in the United States of America and for the Middle East considers the red line towards Iran. The Iranian nuclear program, red line. So the notion of credibility was suddenly linked to that term. I said to my Syrian friends, unfortunately, it's not primarily about you, the red line. The red line is the triangle US, Israel, Iran, and unfortunately you sit in the middle of this. I now have here the report of the Secretary General of the United Nations of today. It reads horribly. I can circulate it. We are still a long way away from having found a solution within the Security Council, where you have many agendas which I'm gladly discussing with you. But the issue clearly is to deal with the chemical weapons is one thing. To stop the fighting, to stop the killing, to stop more than 7 million who are both inside Syria and outside, on the run, out of their houses. We have winter coming, and we have countries like Lebanon and Jordan who come to the very edge of their abilities. So with this, thank you very much.
Okay, so we'd like to open it up for questions and answers, and certainly Professor Kurtzer will also answer questions about Syria as well. But before we start, I just want to put 2 plugs in because this is an audience that I think will be interested in this. We have the President of Tunisia coming next week, Thursday, September 26th, in Richardson, and that's going to be at 5 o'clock. And we have the President of Turkey, who's coming Friday, September 27th, and he will be at 12 noon in Richardson. And so obviously those 2 speakers will touch on a lot of the issues of Arab Spring as well as the Syrian crisis. So I just wanted to put that out there. So questions. And I'm going to call on students first, so students, don't be shy. Raise your hands.
And I would like to say that we make a little reception, an impromptu reception, at the end afterwards in LIC for those of you who want to discuss.
Yes, thanks to the stockpile of wine in Wolfgang's office. We get to have a reception.
Yeah.
Yep.
Hi, I'm an MPP student here
Yep.
at the Woodrow Wilson School. My professional knowledge and background involves the war in Bosnia in the 1990s. And I unfortunately focused on the Srebrenica massacre, which happened at the tail end of a multi-year war And my understanding of that conflict is that although particularly the Bosnian Muslims had a very strong interest in not losing their people in huge numbers, they nevertheless carried on fighting, as did the Bosnian Serbs, because they believed they could get more out of staying in the fight than they could do from getting to the negotiation table. So when you talk about getting people to the table, having a diplomatic solution, what are the mechanisms by which you imagine the parties being brought to that table, other than flying them all to Dayton and locking them up for a month, which is what seemed to work in Bosnia?
I thought that's really touchy because I just 2 hours ago finished an article referring to my experience. I was in Bosnia as an ECMM member, and I was with Christopher Hill in Kosovo, and I hope Chris Hill is coming here anyway also. For me, the example is Kosovo. By the way, just to give you an idea about the brutality of the Syrian conflict, before I came here, because I was just writing on this stuff, I went through the notebooks, and I wanted to tell you that we have now, after 2 years, more than 100,000 dead, and more than nearly 7 million being sort of moved out of their houses. In Bosnia, we had, at the end of the 4.5-year war, 100,000 dead, and roughly, I would do this myself as a guesstimate, something like 3 million or 4 million, if it was. In Kosovo, which nearly, to quote Sir Michael Rose, General Sir Michael Rose, who nearly brought us to World War III on the airport of Pristina, we had only, terrible, I'm sorry, one is too many, okay? I really would like to be on record for that. But we had 5,000 dead and 300,000, if max, moved. So it just shows you where Syria is on that level. And the United Nations considers Syria the single biggest humanitarian crisis since its existence. To answer, Kosovo, and there Samantha Powers sort of moves it a bit. Kosovo worked out of a combination. Number one, we began, yes, bombing. Number two, it became very clear, there was a clear message to Slobodan Milosevic, we will not accept that you cleanse. Number three, John Major and others began to prepare, the British Prime Minister, and it was especially the Brits, began to prepare land forces, and on June 10th, 1999, Slobodan Milosevic and the Vice President of Yugoslavia, Milutinovic, received 4 secret indictments by the ICTY, International Criminal Tribunal of Yugoslavia, to be indicted as war criminals. The other 2 were for their respective wives. And that supposedly, as I've heard from many, broke the spine. But there in Kosovo, Rambouillet did not work, as a matter of fact. Dayton, however, worked in 1995 because you had a president of the United States of America who realized that if we don't settle Bosnia, he might lose the next election. And that president at that time, Bill Clinton, had on his hand a magnificent negotiator, Richard Holbrooke, who, through the contact group, I was a young man involved in some of these issues, they really, that worked. The contact group worked, but you had a different international system. The United States carried the day post-Kuwait. The shadows of Kuwait were still there. So today it's a bit more complicated.
If I could jump in and offer maybe a slightly different perspective, both on the diplomacy and then the challenges of essentially Geneva II, which is translating this into a diplomatic outcome. The goals of Geneva II are not contested. They're a ceasefire, transitional government, elections. What does that mean, though? Does it mean that Assad goes before a transitional government, or is Assad part of Geneva? Does it mean a ceasefire in place, or is it a ceasefire in which the gains of the relative parties are concretized and become factors in the Geneva discussions? Who plays in the Geneva negotiations? Is Iran a party or is Iran not a party? So it's getting to Geneva is a wonderful goal, but the diplomacy is now beset by extraordinary differences of view that have not necessarily changed as a result of the chemical weapons advances. And we don't even know if the chemical weapons business is going to be seen through. But even if it does start to work, it doesn't necessarily lead to a breakthrough on Geneva. The one part where I might take slight issue with Wolfgang, he's the expert on Bosnia and Kosovo. One of the factors at play in the decision by the United States to try to convene Dayton, I think was less a factor of domestic American politics. In other words, I think that was not a major factor. I think the major factor was an assessment made that the parties had reached essentially a standoff and were tired. And we were just talking in class about stalemates and mutually hurting stalemates. I don't know about the academic literature so much applying here, but I remember vividly at the time that the assessment inside the U.S. government was that both parties were ready for something, some deus ex machina, to get them out of a conflict which also seemed to have no end. The question today in Syria is whether we're approaching that same moment. And I don't know if we are. You listen to Bashar al-Assad, who was on 60 Minutes last night, he's feeling pretty good about himself. The opposition, as fragmented as it is, may be a little bit down in the mouth now because of what they feel is a setback of this chemical weapons business, but they may not be ready to translate this moment into diplomacy when they are very much disadvantaged. So I'm not sure we've reached a point of what do they call mutually hurting stalemate in Syria that we're going to be able to translate what we've done or are doing on chemical weapons into Geneva. One other point to make, an issue raised by Professor Weiss. You know, what are the interests here? And as important for Syrian purposes as the issues of freedom and human rights and all the rest are, whether you like it or not, the United States has not defined these issues as central to our policy. We've talked about the need for Assad to go. We've talked about the need for Syria to undertake a transition. But the president was very careful never to create a red line with respect to a Syrian transition. And it took a violation of chemical weapons convention for the president to say a red line had been crossed. Now, you can make the argument that people killed by conventional means are as dead as those killed by chemical weapons. And 99,000 people killed by conventional means should have made an impact on the United States. You can make that argument, but the president never made it. The president basically said that the national interest of the United States is to see Assad go and to see Syria transition, but he did not declare that it was enough of our interest for us to intervene. It was only on this issue of chemical weapons. And that's where I think the road ahead is going to be much more problematic if there's an expectation that somehow U.S. policy is going to now shift into a higher gear in order to bring the Syrian conflict to an end. I'm not so sure.
I'd like also to say, in response to two of the issues that are now on the table, last your comment about what I was getting at. I mean, by no means would I want to argue that the history of U.S. involvement in the Middle East has in any way been defined as one that seeks to promote democracy, freedom, and human rights, despite the glowing rhetoric to the contrary on certain occasions. Indeed, it seems as though U.S. strategic interests tend more towards the preservation of stability above all else in the region in order to secure the kind of strategic military partnerships that Ambassador Kurtzer was referring to with respect to the long view in terms of the Egyptian regime, but also other allies and non-allies for that matter in the region. With respect to the question of how to get to the diplomatic table, I think it's also worth emphasizing that despite the apparent difficulty of the question regarding whether Iran has a seat at the table, or regarding whether any one of the major regional or international actors has a seat at the table, it seems indisputable at this point that we have reached a certain point in which it is no longer possible to talk about the unchecked use of U.S. hard power and soft influence in the Middle East or anywhere else. And so I think it stands to reason that the point of departure for any diplomatic negotiation must be a recognition of the multipolarity of the international system and the regional system in the Middle East at the moment, which necessitates the participation of major players on both the regional and the international scale. So I would say in response to the original question that the only hope for a diplomatic solution, whether we call it Geneva II or something else, somewhere else, must come through a recognition of that multipolar reality.
Hi, my name is Jamie Morgan. I'm TA1 in the Woodrow Wilson School. You both talked, or all of you talked about the U.S. strategic interests in both of these conflicts. I, for one here, spent some time in research on terrorist radicalization. And I mean, we've heard about various fundamentalist groups in both conflicts. And some of the, I'm not an expert, I don't know that much about the Middle East, but some of the things that I'm hearing are things that can or have been shown to lead to radicalization, such as political oppression in Egypt, violence and perceived lack of caring by the outside world in Syria. To what extent do you see terrorist radicalization as a long-term risk in both of these conflicts, and to what extent do you think that that's a strategic interest of the United States in both situations?
Well, there's no question that in Egypt, one of our strategic interests has been I don't have any control over the microphone.
What is the question? We can't hear back.
I'll repeat the question if my mic turns on. Am I on now? Yeah? Can you hear me? Yeah. The question was whether or not the United States is focused on the problem of the radicalization of these situations in both Egypt and Syria and also elsewhere of the population to increase terrorism.
Well, and I guess should it be, not necessarily is it, but do you think knowing the region and the situation in both countries?
So is the United States focused on it, and should the United States be focused on it? And I think the answer is, in both cases that we're talking about, very much that it is a central feature of American concern. One of the hallmarks of U.S.-Egyptian strategic cooperation has been in the area of counterterrorism. It's not talked about a lot, but it's one of those areas where intelligence sharing and information sharing with respect to terrorism has paid dividends for both countries. And it's one of those areas that the United States would be very unhappy about losing should the relationship with Egypt change in very dramatic ways. It's probably, as Professor Weiss was suggesting, one of the factors now that's prompting Washington to be cautious in criticizing the crackdowns by the military, because part of that crackdown is a crackdown against what we would call potential terrorists, particularly those trying to base themselves in Sinai and those that may be indigenous to Egypt proper. In Syria, the problem is complicated, as you heard, and I'm sure Professor Weiss and Professor Danspeckgruber will provide more details. The degree to which the Syrian opposition now has become not just fragmented into hundreds of semi-autonomous groupings, but the percentage, which is estimated today or yesterday in a publication by Janes of London as being 50% Islamist, and of that 50%, upwards of half of that being jihadist or al-Qaeda. So if those numbers are in the ballpark, then 25% of the opposition in Syria is of an orientation that we would define in the United States as terrorist, and therefore that has to be a motivation for American policy.
Well, I don't want to recycle an old cliche, but it really depends on what we mean by terrorism, of course, and this is not a seminar room per se, so I won't go into the different ways that I want to understand the term, but I think it's fair to say that, and Ambassador Kurtzer opens an interesting way to think about this, specifically with respect to Syria. I mean, there are subtle variations that one could identify among groupings that we could call Muslim, Islamist, jihadist, fundamentalist, and on, and we could parse it as specifically as you would like to, and there are experts all around this campus who do this on a daily basis, but I would like to emphasize the extent to which, at least in the case of the Syrian opposition, that this problem, the problem of Islamic fundamentalist infiltration of the Syrian opposition, has been a cornerstone of both the regime rhetoric on the part of the Syrians. From day one, the opposition has been discredited to be constituted by terrorist wreckers who seek to destabilize the venerable state of Syria. And on the other hand, at least from the safe distance, much as was said, I don't actually sit at the table. I'm in, as Professor Danspeckgruber said, I'm in the vicinity of the conversations. My understanding was that much of the official US administration position on this matter had a similar flavor, namely, we are not going to get too deeply involved during the first year and a half of the Syrian uprising with the opposition for fear that these are precisely those figures, those, from a very cynical perspective, those bogeymen are going to, in turn, create an even larger problem for us. So the issue at stake, at least in the minds of those Syrian secular and secularist revolutionaries that I know, is not whether there are Islamists or radical Islamists in the ranks of the Syrian opposition or within the Syrian social body. Indeed, there are. The question is whether that is the most pressing political issue to be dealt with at the moment, or whether the issue of, from their perspective, ousting Assad and his regime, or at least putting an end to the killing in the country, ought to be, those two ought to be, from their perspective, the central issues, and not the extent to which there is a terroristic threat.
If I could have the map of the fighting. I wanted to tell you something not quite in principle. The issue of terror, the issue of radicalization, and the issue of moving to what we would call really terrorist ends is obviously something which is there. But under regular circumstances of a real house-to-house combat situation, as we have it there, I don't know whether any of you has ever lived or trained for house-to-house combat. And I don't know whether you have any idea of what's going on in these areas where you have, for weeks, no electricity, little food, barely water, no shelter, and injured, and no medication, and no medical services, obviously. In
Bosnia, we began calling this pressure cooker mentality. You can't get out.
You have nothing to eat. Your kids are around. There's no school. There's no, there's of course no job, no nothing. And this contributes to radicalization. And if you look at the map where you see that you have, unfortunately by now, of the main inhabited areas, 80% being involved and being concerned and touched, then it clearly shows that something is happening, which yes, might, and I couldn't agree more, obviously contribute to radicalization even of the just normal folks of the street. And in addition to this now, and there unfortunately comes in your concern, you have had in the last 18 months, very clearly, very well-documented influences by more radical elements who also be very much better trained and equipped. And this unfortunately relates to this real problem. Whom are we going to support? Are we not going to do anything and let this thing go down? Well, people need support. People need something because the fighting continues for whatever reasons. So they take support wherever it comes from. And I've seen so many reports where it's saying these countless young ones who join whatever, it's not for them that they have an ideology or they join they have some religious agenda, but they need money, ammunition, and they want to get into it, and they want to help feed, and make their family survive. So you have all these things, but plus you have a tremendous lack of discipline and organization and structure in the Free Syrian Army units. So unfortunately, by now, you have, in addition to all this, another element, a sectarian element, a religious element. Where in addition to regular house-to-house combat and to fighting and to fighting against the regime, you have now elements of outside support which clearly go to certain areas. And then, and here comes in now a whole Russian dimension. You have Armenians, Circassians, Chechenians, Uzbeks and others from Central Asia. And these are people who have been, through the pogroms of the 19th century, moved from their area to Syria. Obviously, Turkey, Armenia, don't need to tell you. I also don't need to tell you, and we shouldn't forget this, Aleppo is presumably the world's oldest continuously inhabited city. How old do you think it is? 8,000 years. Even the Chinese have described for their culture. Damascus is some 7,000 years old. These are regions and cultures which are from ancient time inhabited. So there is a whole other element of civilization there in the game as well. And fast forward to us now, clear principle. The longer a conflict goes on, the more the conflict intensifies. The higher the chance that radical elements will take. See and operate.
I have a question. Professor Weiss mentioned these local leaders who played a key role in yes, Professor Weiss had mentioned these local leaders who could play a key role in helping build democratic institutions in Syria. And so my question is, how do you think, or do you think these groups can be brought to the negotiating table in any eventual dialogue that happens to bring an end to the conflict? And do you think that we can learn any lessons from what happened in Afghanistan during the response to the Soviet invasion with our support for like certain elements of the Mujahideen? And are there any lessons we could learn from that?
As far as I know, and I hope I'm wrong, there is not a successful case of civil society being built in a post-authoritarian context by help from the outside. And your problem in Syria is that you've had an authoritarian dictatorship for a long time, certainly since Assad came to power in 1970, 69, 70, and even before that when you had a great amount of instability in the country. And you basically had a void when it came to civil society. What's expected in a context of revolution, what we'd like to see is that civil society emerges into not only the groups that promote economic and social activities, but also political forces. And it doesn't happen easily. You take Egypt as an example, where you had a very vibrant civil society before the revolution, but it was a government-sponsored civil society, which, is government NGOs, which is a contradiction in terms, but that's largely the way Egypt's, 80,000 NGOs were mostly supported by government. So there was a hope that after Mubarak left office, that vacuum could be filled by people who had some experience in promoting their own social, civic interests. And it still is possible. What you haven't had in Egypt is the coalescing of that civil society into stable political forces that can contest an election, that can mobilize people into parties and so forth. But you still have that hope because there is an infrastructure that's potentially in place. I could be wrong, but I don't see that in Syria. And that's going to be the problem in trying to build a credible political opposition on the basis of an already terribly fragmented military opposition that's beset within itself and doesn't have common goals that it could bring to a table.
think you might be overstating the case to say that there are no foundations, whether intellectually or institutionally, to build upon in Syria for the promotion and the continued building of something approximating a democratic system. It's certainly the case that government-organized NGOs were the norm once NGOs became the norm. In the case of Syria, prior to that, certainly all social and political elements were co-opted by the Ba'athist regime. That's true from the March 8th coup of 1963. It's even more the case following the November 1970 so-called correctionist movement that Hafez al-Assad and his coterie led. However, from the early 1980s, there was something approximating both economic and political liberalization in the country, such that the boundaries of civic and political discourse were broadened. If there was a broadening during the 80s and 90s, there was a veritable, and this is relatively speaking, flourishing under Bashar al-Assad from 2000 forward in terms of the activities and the freedom to organize on the part of Syrian civil society activists. And I use these terms with caution and the necessary caveats, because this is certainly not exactly a free system. However, it's interesting to note that many of the key players in the Syrian opposition at the moment, those members of the National Council that seem to be circled around like musical chairs, have roots, at least 3 of the 5 of the most recent heads, in the so-called Damascus Declaration of 2005, which was a tremendous moment of at least quasi-democratic possibility, in which some 100 intellectuals, artists, writers, and political activists got together and set out a multi-point platform for democratic transition in Syria. And that was not the first time. That was simply the most celebrated example of this kind of activity. So even before 2011, I think there were certain foundations in place for precisely such a transition. With the flowering of the Syrian uprising in March 2011, there was a new generation, if you like, Syrian Democratic Opposition 2.0, it could be called, which is represented by these young activists with the local coordination councils, committees, who managed to build a really impressive both web infrastructure and communications infrastructure that has already been somewhat integrated into the National Council. And some of these folks are now represented in the quasi-parliament in exile, or quasi-representative body in exile of the Syrian opposition. However, the bigger issue, which gets to the heart of your question, is how such an opposition in a situation of ongoing and indeed escalating civil and regional war is going to be able to assert itself in relation to very powerful and entrenched outside Syrian opposition activists, and in opposition to very powerful regional and international players. So again, the original point I made, I think, is still central here, namely that those folks are going to continue to be drowned out and marginalized.
There's a very clear process which we developed from summer last year, actually, with Geneva onwards. And it entails, has 3 major elements. The element on the ground, those key stakeholders from the outside, and the key stakeholders inside. And the first thing you have to recognize, you have to talk with all parties who are stakeholders, Iran included. There's no question about it. Lakhdar Brahimi is, by the way, also on the books for that. The first thing is you have a ceasefire. You enforce that ceasefire with pressuring those who are stakeholders from the outside towards their clients or their allies in the inside, and of course with those inside. You have to enforce that ceasefire, however. That's why I say you negotiate, but you have to negotiate with an iron spine. Anybody who violates the ceasefire gets attacked. Just the violation. In the meantime, you get the key stakeholders together. You invite all those who want to be, and this is very important, what you just raised. You have to beware that you don't get trapped by those who say we are a key stakeholder and you would like to have them here, but in reality they are not stakeholders on the ground. It's very important to get the key stakeholders from the reality on the ground involved. And then you begin your process. But the importance is, parallel to this, an immediate and effective launching of humanitarian operations to help those who are there.
Okay, I think we really only have time for one more, but in the back, you've had your hand up, and Will, you've had your
Combine
hand
a
up.
couple of them.
So why don't we combine these two
Yeah.
questions? Yeah, so both, it's like, see if we can smush the answers together.
So I spent 7 weeks in Kilis this summer, which is about 5 kilometers north of Azaz on that map, and it's on the Turkish side of the border. And one of the, it's all right near rebel territory, and one of the things that was quite interesting that a lot of the fixers and translators who were affiliated with Free Syrian Army would bring to the table every day was that they were concerned less about the war with Assad in the present and more with the war against the Islamic State of Iraq, which was moving in as we were during this period. During this period, the Islamic State of Iraq in Al-Sham killed an FSA commander in Latakia and kidnapped one in Raqqa, and there's been a lot of fighting in territory that's been controlled by rebels for months. And so if I was never able to comment when they would ask, you know, do you think it's a good thing for the US to intervene? I never had anything to say because there was this war against Assad for the present. But for the future, they seemed almost more concerned about trying, and it's these groups that you were talking about earlier that are interested in a secular Syria still, but a free Syria. Would it be the right time to intervene in some sense in a post-Assad Syria to clear out not so much the Syrian jihadi problem, but the foreign jihadi problem?
Okay, Will?
I guess also on this question of U.S. involvement in both Egypt and Syria, I mean, one of the most common criticisms of the Obama administration has been this purported lack of a strategy toward both Syria and Egypt. But Ambassador, you suggested a sort of alternate narrative that perhaps the administration hasn't come out as explicitly in saying, and that is, well, we've defended our core interests in Egypt, we've kept the Syrian conflict, you know, we're addressing the chemical weapons issue, and we've kept the Syrian conflict relatively within Syria's borders. So is the rest, you know, sort of style points, as President Obama said, or do we, you know, so I'm just curious to hear your thoughts on that question.
Can you smush those?
I thought we were taking more than two. Do you want
Well, very simple. If we try to stabilize the country, and if we try to make for the individuals some kind of foreseeable and relatively safe future, we have to get into the country. You can't resolve this with cruise missiles. What is this thinking? You have to deliver it. I don't need to tell you. And yes, there were countless infringements, as you said. And just today, by the way, Turkey shot off a helicopter. On these things we hear only on the top of the iceberg. The issue is, I firmly believe it would have to be some kind of UN forces. And it has to be, however, a peacemaking, meaning that you need a host country agreement, and you need a necessary teeth behind it. You cannot create an armistice, a ceasefire, without enforcement. You cannot. You have to have it enforced. That might be part of an answer to you. The real problem in this whole issue is, and Ambassador Kurtzer and I, we have discussed this since years, Moscow-Washington relationship, and that relates to your question of strategy. Syria, my friends, take this away with you. The fate for the Syrians was sealed by Libya. The reason why Russia and China have blocked so long in the Security Council was because they all felt taken for a ride by the UN Security Council resolutions, which were supposedly helping humanitarian assistance and protecting civilians in Libya, and eventually turned out to be regime change. And the Russians said once, not again. And so we had 3 blocks in the Security Council. And I hope that somehow now the ice is broken. But it also is important that the United States of America is acting with one voice to the outside. which doesn't always seem to be the case. Then you need some kind of top-down from a reverberated UN Security Council in which you also have the influence of the BRIC states. You need some top-downing, and eventually you have to have some kind of international presence in Syria, and for me, first and foremost, also to assist, to bring in humanitarian assistance, which we can't bring in, by the way, by the time.
You know, I would connect Wolfgang's second point to the first point, because he's exactly right that you can't get a United Nations Security Council resolution that has a meaningful enforcement capacity now that involves a vote by the United States and Russia. You can't get it. But if you can't get it, then holding out the hope of a ceasefire with enforcement is unrealistic.
That's right.
This is not going to
That's
happen in
absolutely right.
practical terms. And that's been the conundrum that first Kofi Annan faced, and now Lakhdar Brahimi faces. It's not the ideas that are wrong. The ideas are fine, as I mentioned, ceasefire, transitional government, elections. You can get everybody to line up behind them, even if they have different motivations for pursuing those ideas. You can't get to the starting gate
If you don't have
on the basis of a consensus within the international community on the rules of the game or on the participants at the table. I agree Iran should be at the table, but that's not what the international community has necessarily agreed upon. And there's still a difference of view about that. So if we're thinking about diplomatic outcomes here, you know, it reminds me, just before the Libyan intervention, I think it was Senator Lindsey Graham. I've been trying to find the quote. It goes to the question. He was asked, does it matter to you that it may be that the jihadists end up benefiting from a UN bombing campaign in Libya? And Senator Graham said, no, key is to get rid of Gaddafi. Really? Yeah, the key is to get rid of Gaddafi, but don't we care as the United States what the successor to Gaddafi, put in parentheses Assad, put in parentheses the next dictator, will be? And if it doesn't matter to us, then I think our leadership is being irresponsible. And that, in a sense, gets to the question about strategy and style points. Whether or not I agree with the president's policy, I think it's been totally transparent. This president has not seen a conflict in the Middle East that, in his sense, should drive the United States to become militarily involved in the way that we were involved in Iraq. Afghanistan's different, remember. This was the war that the president said should be fought. But he has not yet seen a conflict that should draw the United States in to the extent that we were drawn in or we went in with our eyes open in Iraq. Now, if you say, well, what about Libya? What did the president get for Libya? He got a UN Security Council resolution. He may have gotten it on one basis, which was responsibility to protect, and maybe used it for some other purpose. But he did get an international mandate, which the Russians, as Wolfgang noted, believe was violated. He can't get an international mandate, so what was his alternative? Get a congressional mandate. And I think he couldn't have gotten a congressional mandate either. So the style points comes in because he hasn't explained this well to us. Instead of saying to the American people, if you really want to go into Syria and have 100,000 or 75,000 troops on the ground, we had Colonel Sam Gardner, a friend of ours, who comes to Princeton periodically, has done an analysis just to safeguard the chemical weapons. Just to safeguard the chemical weapons. He's talking 75,000 troops on the ground. Okay? You want to get rid of Assad? Double that number. Who in America would vote for that? Very few people. So the president hasn't explained it well, and I think his style points, he gets an F. But in terms of policy, it's been very clear. He doesn't want to do this. As much as it hurts in humanitarian, and it hurts me to say it because people are being killed. And people are suffering, not just the 100,000 killed. What about the families of all those who are now suffering? But the president doesn't see this as motivating American national interests to become involved on the ground. And that's what I think the black and white issue for us is, do we agree with that or not? If we don't, then, you know, call Rush Holt, call Senator Menendez, call our representatives and say, no, we want to go involved and be involved. But you can't criticize this president for basically being honest about the fact that he doesn't want to intervene.
last word?
It feels wrong for this fish who flopped in from the other side of the street to take that last word, but I just I would respond to the question up top by saying there seems to be a major misunderstanding of the situation in Syria on the part of the U.S. and the global left and its knee-jerk anti-war rhetoric, by which I mean there is already a proxy war going on in Syria at both regional and international levels, some of which is being discussed very transparently, some of which I know is not being discussed very transparently. I don't know what I don't know, but I know there are things I don't know. So, to go back to an older way of talking about things. That said, it's very interesting to think about the difference in terms of the way U.S. political discourse, popular and official, on the question of intervention, tout court, is going to proceed if we think about it in terms of the pinprick cruise missile versus the notion of getting our hands dirty and, I don't know, training rebels in camps in places like Jordan. And this raises very difficult, I think, of a different nature qualitatively questions than those about whether the U.S. should be involved or not involved, as if it's a binary choice. Given the extent to which this is already a proxy war, at least in my understanding of the situation, it can only be resolved in the ways that I think both Professor Danspeckgruber and Ambassador Kurtzer have been suggesting, namely by finding a way to get to the starting gate. And I think that was a very helpful and insightful point for thinking this through. But I also recognize that the view from the ground level is very different than the view from Washington. And so I would just close by saying that I think it's very important for U.S. political and media discourse to begin taking much more seriously those Syrian voices on the ground in the country and on its fringes than have been given an opportunity to speak, at least in the kind of media circus that happened in the past 2 weeks.
If I could just add one more point, just on this last point. One of the questions, forget what you call the hard left. Let's talk about the hard power analysts in this country. One of the questions that they're analyzing against the backdrop of the issue of this proxy war. In other words, if Assad remains in power, the theory goes, then the Iranian influence in the region is enhanced. We now see Russian influence enhanced. American influence is in decline, and Israeli security interests are harmed. That's the argument for the proxy war leading to American action, okay? But the hard power analysts also have to take into account the question of whether or not American power was enhanced as a result of the last two interventions of the United States in this region. Did they help our credibility? Did they help our deterrence? Did they help the projection of American values and power? And most of those answers, I think, are no. Now, that doesn't mean that we should never intervene in conflicts. There are going to be conflicts in which hard American interests are at stake. I think the problem, not just for the hard left, but for the hard power advocates, is that they have not yet defined Syria in terms of an assault on concrete American interests that would require us to employ military force. If that argument can be made, then hopefully this is a president who can be persuaded. But so far, I don't think that argument has been made.
This is actually a very important way to conclude it, because I'm afraid Syria has become bigger than the poor Syrians, for me, in self-determination, individual man, woman, and child. It's become bigger than the region and the macro-region, and has really transcended into a huge case, not only for R2P, responsibility to protect, but also in view of what you just said, how does the United States of America, which has, especially in the 1990s, argued that we won the Cold War. Remember, should I remind you on the peace dividend? We then had, just a couple of days ago, celebrated the 12th anniversary of a sad event, which for me really changed the world. But it also made clear that many of those international orders and this international framework is in an innate changing mode. You have an intensely multipolar world. Brazil, Russia, India, Indonesia, China, South Africa, and an erstarking Germany, and a Europe which has to find itself, and a Russia which tries to reassert itself. How does the world, my friends, look 15 years down the road? If colleagues of us in the diplomatic community already now hold Libya against us, hold Iraq against us, what might they say we did with Syria, or we didn't? The way how this crisis is resolved also transcends the administration of President Obama and goes already far into the next presidency. And I really think it's very important that we keep that in mind.